Well, good morning, everybody, and thanks for the opportunity to be with you today to bring this perspective on a very fraught issue facing so many in this room, this town, this state, this country, the whole planet. When I call this a Sisters of Mercy response, I don't mean a response from one Sister of Mercy, but one response to the issue made in the name of the Sisters of Mercy. So as Karen has just said, a group of us came here to Chinchilla last year. The trip had been organised because two sisters with international connections were visiting Australia, and they wanted to meet with people experiencing the effects of unconventional gas extraction. And Sister Margaret Endicott in Brisbane had the responsibility for organising the itinerary of our two visitors. And then I was working with Dr. Mark Copland at the Toowoomba Catholic Diocese Social Justice Commission, and we'd built up quite a strong connection with people adversely affected by the activities of mining operations in this area. So Margaret contacted me, and we arranged for the two visiting sisters to come to this town and to the surrounding farms with coal seam gas and underground coal gasification activities occurring on their properties. So the two visiting sisters were Sister Anya O'Connor, a Sister of Mercy, and Sister Denise Boyle, who was a Franciscan sister. Now Anya, at that time, was the coordinator of Mercy International Association Global Action at the United Nations in New York. I'll talk a bit about that later. But thanks to Karen and other members of the community here, passionate, committed landholders, and a couple of clergy, a gathering and a tour were devised. And unfortunately, the tour was to include one of the Bender properties. And the day before we arrived was the day we heard that George Bender had tragically died under circumstances that we all now know. And we're very fortunate to have Helen here with us today, who has done such wonderful work in honouring her father. Now, perhaps because of the Bender family's situation, the media became interested in what Sister Anya from New York was doing. Some of the media decided that the Sisters of Mercy had come to Chinchilla to mourn with the Bender family, but that wasn't the case at all. But I guess it says something about what people expected of the Sisters of Mercy. So Anya is the person who has been responsible for the document that I'm going to open to you today. So I'm indebted to her for the great work that she has done in this whole area of using human rights to advocate on behalf of the earth and of people affected by activities such as fracking and underground coal gasification. But before approaching the actual subject of looking at this document, I might just pose the question of why Sisters of Mercy are engaged in research and advocacy in this area of mining and extractive industries. Well, perhaps even though it's not been very well known, the Catholic Church has a very strong teaching on social justice. And the principles of social justice can be applied to the situation of folk being affected by extractive industries. Some of the principles of Catholic social teaching that can be evoked in addressing the present issues are stewardship of creation, the dignity of the human person, the common good, and if we think about how they may apply to this industry, I think you can see some connection. And of course, as Sisters of Mercy, as members of the Church, we have embraced these principles. However, the very name Mercy is another compelling reason for us to be involved in this area. Because mercy, in our understanding, mercy is compassion, it is reaching out to the marginalised, it's responding to the needs that we see before us. And I think one of the most interesting statements about mercy has come from Pope Francis, who says, "Mercy is the fundamental law that dwells in the heart of every person who looks sincerely into the eyes of his brothers and sisters." So mercy is the fundamental law that dwells in the heart of every person who looks sincerely into the eyes of his brothers and sisters. But we were founded by Catherine McCauley, an Irish woman, in 1831. And in the circumstances when she existed, there was absolute horrific poverty in Ireland, particularly in Dublin. And that's one of the reasons she founded the Sisters, to address that issue of poverty, address the issue of the need for the education of girls. And she implored her sisters, and she herself, of going out into the streets and meeting the people where they were, and seeing their problems and trying to assist in any way that they could. So that's a little bit of our founders' insight into what Mercy was about in action. And in our own Queen's Australian context, sorry about the writing again, we know that as members of the Earth community, we are integrally connected with each other and with the whole of creation. So that's in our Australian founding a present document in terms of our connection with the whole of creation. And then perhaps the greatest thing that happened last year, as far as we're concerned, is Pope Francis wrote this wonderful letter to all people of the world. And this is what he has to say, and he talks about the sister that is Earth. The sister now cries out to us because of the harm we have inflicted on her by our irresponsible use and abuse of the goods with which God has endowed her. We have come to see ourselves as her lords and masters, entitled to plunder her at will. The violence present in our hearts, wounded by sin, is also reflected in the symptoms of sickness evident in the soil, in the water, in the air, and in all forms of life. This is why the earth herself, burdened and laid waste, is among the most abandoned and maltreated of our poor. She groans in travail. We have forgotten that we ourselves are dust of the earth. Our very bodies are made up of her elements. We breathe her air and we receive life and refreshment from her waters. I think that's a very powerful statement that is about what we are on about. So it's good to have the Pope saying things that we think are wonderful. So I guess we have good credentials for being involved in issues that affect the lives of people, and more increasingly we're becoming involved in issues that affect the whole of the Earth community. So Sisters of Mercy now work within 40 different countries, a bit like the 40 loops of the Nanas. The leaders of our communities throughout the world form an association called Mercy International. And one of the groups within Mercy International is Mercy Global Action, which is the justice arm of Mercy International. And again, the justice issues that Mercy Global Action takes as its priorities are the issues that are brought to them by people on the ground involved in the issues. This was like Catherine going out into the streets and seeing what they were. Then the most significant issues are those around violations of human rights. These include the right to water, the right to healthy environment, and other rights that are impacted by mining. And Mercy Global Action operates locally, nationally and internationally. And that is where the Anya was working when she came here last year at Mercy Global Action at the United Nations in New York. Yes, so working away at the United Nations, Anya had become aware from the different countries in which Sisters of Mercy work and live of the impact of unconventional gas exploration and production on people and on Earth. And these concerns had been raised by sisters in New Zealand, Ireland, Argentina, Canada, the United States, England, and of course here in Australia. So Anya took on the task of looking at this issue from the perspective of human rights. While she was here in Chinchilla, she was very impressed with what she learned, and she's kept in touch with some of the locals. And she has used the issues that she encountered here to make representation at the United Nations on 2 occasions, and we'll see these towards the end of my speech. But during her time at the United Nations, Anya worked with others on a mining working group and who advocated for a rights-based approach to resource extraction in the pursuit of sustainable development. And the group who worked on that also worked on this document that we're going to look at today. And this document is a guide to rights-based advocacy International Human Rights Law and Fracking, prepared by the Sisters of Mercy, the Mercy International Association Global Action. So that's the document we're going to concentrate on now. So who is this guide for? Its stated major purpose is a guide for action by individuals in claiming their rights, whether as individuals affected by fracking or other mining activities, or whether by belonging to a campaigning group wishing to highlight global or local concerns. So this is your guide, Nanas. It is also hoped that the guide would be used by governments or business to guide them when considering proposals related to fracking or other extractive industries. Now, in recent times, of course, the international human rights law found its feet in the aftermath of the Second World War, and international human rights has been evolving over time. And in recent times, it has been noted that the existing international human rights framework has evolved to the point of recognising the interdependence between human rights and the integrity of the environment. And at an event in Santiago, Chile in 2014, John Knox, an independent expert on human rights and the environment, stated, "Human rights law recognises that human rights and environmental protection depend upon each other. To enjoy human rights fully, it is necessary to have a safe and healthy environment. It is critical to protect human rights." Now, international human rights law is composed of 9 core legally binding human rights treaties to which countries have voluntarily agreed to be bound upon ratification. And upon ratification, countries are expected to respect, protect and fulfil the human rights laid out by each particular treaty. Now, the first ones I'm going to show you are the ones that have been used in particular in this document. So they are the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, the International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights, the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, the Convention on the Rights of the Child, and the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. And throughout the document, I won't look at every one of them today, but if you get the document, you'll see where they are noted as being appropriate. So they are the 9 treaties on international human rights law. So, what are the known and potential human rights impacted by fracking and other industries that we're talking about? So, because this document was written with fracking in mind, I'll probably often use that word even though we can apply it to other forms of extractive industries. So in the document, there are 6 human rights identified as being impacted by these processes, and they are. So these are seen as the rights that are impacted: health, water, food, housing, access to information and public participation. Probably no surprise to you to hear that, so I'm sure you could have told me what they were even before you saw them. But I'll go through each one of them now and identify where the rights are being impacted and some of the things that are happening that has an impact on these rights. So under the right to health, there is the right to safe and potable water, the right to healthy occupational and environmental conditions, the right to health information, and the government's duties to regulate and monitor the impact of business activities that may compromise children's right to health. So when we ask questions of fracking and other extractive activities, we find answers that impact on each of these 4 components of the right to health. Now, we know that the right to safe and potable water is a huge issue, and I'll look at that more closely when we look at the effect of these industries on water itself. But the human right to healthy occupational and environmental conditions. The guide states that the right to health is probably the right at highest risk due to fracking. This is because the highest standards of physical and mental health has a strong relationship to other human rights, including the right to food, water, public participation and access to information. Now, those living in close proximity to gas wells, pipelines, evaporation ponds, processing plants and vents, or people in fact living in a gas field, have reported various health effects. And in early 2013, the Queensland Government published a report called Coal Seam Gas in the Tara Region, Summary Risk Assessment of Health Complaints and Environmental Monitoring. The report relied on health complaints data and on environmental monitoring data. The health complaints data relied on two sources. The first was from the then Darling Downs Public Health Unit, and the symptoms being reported to the unit were headaches, rashes, nosebleeds and eye irritations, and particularly in children. And the symptoms being reported to this body were those. The second source of health complaints data came from the visit of a government-appointed doctor deputed to be an independent health expert to investigate the complaints made to the Darling Downs Public Health Unit. Now, both sets of data concluded that there was very little evidence that the reported symptoms could be caused by the fact that the complainants lived in a gas field. And the environmental monitoring data as another source for the report was again not very conclusive. There was some dissatisfaction expressed in the report with the air monitoring method, especially the need to determine long-term effects of air quality in the region instead of taking data for a couple of hours. But the conclusion from the summary risk assessment is this. Based on the clinical and environmental monitoring data available for this summary risk assessment, a clear link cannot be drawn between the health complaints by some residents in the Tara region and impacts of the local CSG industry on air, water or soil within the community. The available evidence does not support the concern among some residents that excessive exposure to emissions from CSG activities is the cause of the symptoms they have reported. So that's a lovely conclusion. Now, there were a number of recommendations from the report related to establishing a reference group to monitor and inform residents of any health issues that may arise in the future. There was some activity in this area, however, the residents would maintain that there was very little integrity in the carrying out of these recommendations. Now, one of the major criticisms of the above report is that there was no baseline data with which to compare the prevalence of symptoms at the time of the investigation by the Queensland Government. However, in a more detailed report on the health effects of living in a gas field, Dr. Geraldine McCarran, GP from Brisbane who visited regularly, demonstrated the change in symptoms occurring before and after the gas wells arrived in the Tara residential estates. And her report was called The Symptomatology of a Gas Field. And her research was done later in 2013. And families in this area again reported the same symptoms as they had to the Queensland Government. Although Geraldine herself will say that her method had some problems, it demonstrates that a gas field environment is not a healthy place to live. It showed that the severity and occurrence of the symptoms experienced since the operation of the gas wells were well above those experienced before the arrival of the gas wells. These results seem to be more indicative that the symptoms had a direct correlation with the arrival of the CSG industry in the region. And studies in other countries have identified other health issues such as low birth weights in children born to mothers living in proximity to shale gas wells. And I think the direct experience of residents who complain is testimony to the health effects of living in proximity to CSG operations with all of the infrastructure required to carry out this activity. So the right to access health information. The right to access to health information has a huge impact on those living in an area surrounded by gas wells and the accompanying infrastructure. They are faced with so much uncertainty. If fracking is occurring, there is insufficient data regarding the composition of fracking fluids. The companies that operate in this area publish some data, mainly to proclaim that they do not use VTEX, that is benzene, toluene, ethylbenzene and styloids, volatile organic compounds which are carcinogenic. However, full disclosure is not always available. The Queensland Government Department of Environment and Heritage Protection states that the chemicals used in fracking typically include common household compounds, and they list compounds that are used in swimming pools, soaps and vinegar. The use of the word includes indicates that there are other compounds that they haven't mentioned, but they give no indication of what these are. And in referring to commonly used products, they want to reassure us that there's nothing to fear. The uncertainty can lead to anxiety, distress, and fear of what may occur after extended exposure to fumes that emanate from the vents along the pipeline, from compressor plant leaks, from evaporation ponds, from spraying of contaminated water on roads, and so on. In some cases, this uncertainty has led people to accept offers to move under a secret buyout or cash settlement scheme. It can also lead to quite serious mental health issues, especially when there is limited response from the governments on health-related issues. So when advocating on your own behalf or on behalf of others, this right to access to health information can be a powerful tool. So then the government's duty to regulate and monitor the impact of business activities that may impact or impose children's rights to health. As can be seen from the Queensland Government's response to the health issues brought before it in 2012, very little seems to have been done to abide by this duty to monitor the CSG industry as regards its impacts on health, especially on children. In searching the web for health monitoring of CSG, the information found relates to general safety checks that companies must abide by. I'm not sure who actually monitors that such compliance always occurs. However, the health of children is of paramount importance. Part of the Nana's reason for being is to save the world for the kiddies. Now, one woman in the United States who has been an outstanding candidate for putting this issue before the world is a woman called Sandra Steingraber. And I'm going to show you, I hope, an interview she gave on the eve of Thanksgiving 2014. And you'll hear that she speaks about the Seneca Lake. Seneca Lake is one of what they call the Finger Lakes in upper New York State. Over this side you have the Great Lakes, and Canada's up here, and then there are these three sort of finger lakes that come down, and Seneca Lake is the deepest of those lakes, and it's the deepest lake in the whole of New York State. And so this is, hopefully, that's Sandra herself. And, oh no, there should be somewhere down the bottom where's the tech people? She had been to jail before. She's a cancer survivor, and she felt that going to jail, having cancer, helped her to survive jail, because you have to be a resistant person to cope with cancer and to cope with going to jail. And she felt better about her second time going to jail because she had some experience from the first time. And she made the point that there are a lot of mothers in jail. And she was aware that people would be saying to her, why was she going to jail on the eve of Thanksgiving when she could be at home having Thanksgiving with her children? And her response to that was, we as mothers are here to protect our children. If things are going on in the environment that are going to be destructive to our children, then I think that the best thing I can do is to show by my being prepared to go to jail that this is the ultimate thing I can do to protect my children, to protest about the environmental effects that could harm the health of my children. So sorry you can't see her actually speaking. So that's what one mother was prepared to do. She understands the importance of protecting her children from health hazards. So the right to water. These include the rights to water supplies, adequate to maintain human dignity, life and health. The right to freedom from interference with the right to water, such as contamination of water supply. The right to water free from risky elements like chemical substances that threaten people's health. And the state's duties to protect the right to water from interference with third parties. State's duties to stop pollution, inequitable extraction and unsustainable use of water resources. State's duties to end pollution of watersheds by harmful chemicals. Sound familiar? So as we read through this list, I'm sure that you can join with me in seeing how the elements of the right to water are in danger from activities such as coal seam gas. There are two main ways in which this right to water can be compromised. First one is contamination. The second one is depletion. So contamination can occur in a number of ways, as you would know. The first is that of leakage of chemicals used in the fracking process, and gases can also escape into waterways, and evidence of gas bubbling has been observed here in the Condamine River. However, there is also the issue of what is lovingly called produced water. This water is the byproduct of the whole fracking operation. It can contain chemicals injected into the system, as well as naturally occurring contaminants which then get into the water. And the water is very salty due to the chemicals it contains. Here it is stored in evaporation ponds or in holding ponds. From there it is treated so that it can be used for purposes such as irrigation or to boost river systems. This of course is the situation here in Chinchilla, where some farmers are irrigating with this water, and it also flows into the weir. Now, although the treatment process is said to be of the highest standard, equivalent to that of drinking water, not all people are convinced that this is so. And although there are rules regarding the use of this water, there doesn't seem to be strong enforcement of such rules. So depletion occurs, of course, to the extraction of water that is used in the process. Depletion is an issue where the availability of a sufficient and continuous water supply is undermined. As we know, fracking is a water-intensive industry. The amount of water used in any operation varies according to the size, the depth and other variables. Here in Australia, of course, there is concern over the amount of water being taken from the Great Artesian Basin. There appears to be uncertainty regarding the extent of the impact of CSG water usage on the Great Artesian Basin. And it's not only the amount of water being taken from the basin, but it's also the weight of water needed to bring pressure on the underlying aquifers to allow the flow of water to the surface. And now in 2014, the Australian Bore Water Users Association commissioned Soil Futures Consulting to report on the Great Artesian Basin recharge systems and the extent of petroleum and gas leases. The following table shows the extent of production and exploration leases and where they occur within the Great Artesian Basin. So all those little dots represent parts of the Great Artesian Basin where there are gas leases or exploration over it. So their Soil Futures report was published in 2014 and later revised after ministerial review in 2015. And it found that the granting of mining leases looked at the individual impact of a mining or gas lease on water usage, but there was no overall consideration of accumulated impacts over the whole recharge areas. And one of the findings was that the areas of the Great Artesian Basin with the highest recharge rates had significant exploration or production leases over them. And they see this as a concern for the future of the Great Artesian Basin. And this is a statement from the report. Recognition of CSG as a water user needs to be given parity with groundwater irrigation users. It needs to be monitored stringently to ensure that the overlying water resource, the Great Artesian Basin, is not affected and the recharge resource is properly managed to maintain hydraulic head, that's the water weight. So the report suggested that measures be taken by government to protect water in a similar vein as those steps that have been taken in some places to protect prime agricultural land. The importance of water can never be underestimated. It has a value far beyond any economic one, and people all over the world are taking action to save precious water, especially from mining activities. And when Anya was here last year, she illustrated this with a story from Peru. So I have another story from Peru to share with you. And this is about a woman called Maxima Acuna Nisholpe. In 2011, Yanacocha, which is a mining company, brought up lands in the area where she lived in Peru in order to expand their operations into a new mine, the Conga mine. The company claims legal ownership of Maxima's land, while Maxima says she never sold any of her land to the company, and the land deeds bear her name. In 2012, she said, "I may be poor, I may be illiterate, but I know that our mountain lakes are our real treasure. Are we expected to sacrifice our water and our land so that the mining people can take gold back to their country? Are we supposed to sit quietly and just let them poison our land and water?" Now, the Conga mine had plans to dry up 5 lakes, including the one that Maxima's land borders. And in 2012, the mining company sued Maxima and her family for alleged illegal occupation of their own land. And the court ruled in the mining company's favour. The judge sentenced 4 members of the family to suspended jail sentences, but they were then overturned in December 2014 with a verdict that saw Maxima victorious against the mining claim to her land. However, after that verdict, things intensified, and on 3rd of February 2015, agents from the Peruvian Police Special Operations Division and private security forces destroyed parts of Maxima's house. They were undergoing construction. And 1 year later, again stormed by security forces in 2016, her home was burnt, tried to be destroyed, and they tried to destroy the crop of her potatoes. But since then, surprisingly, the company has said, "We do not anticipate development of Conga for the foreseeable future." And she was awarded a special prize earlier this year for her protest against the mining company. And this is a little chant poem that she wrote, and again, I couldn't get the video, but I got the words.
Sound's gone.
Oh, that was me. You want me to read it to you? Yes. I am a woman from the highlands that lives in the mountain ranges, pasturing my sheep in mist and very rain. When my dogs barked, the police arrived. My hut they took apart. My things they took away. And they robbed my sheep. Sheep's head soup they drank. I had nothing. I covered myself with hay. Food I didn't eat, only water I did drink. I wanted to dig for my lagoons and they attacked me with their bullets. My life I am going to lose because I defend my lagoons. So that was her story, but she won in the end. So to all you knitting nanas and your friends, winning can occur. It's interesting that the international treaties relating to water are treaties about women. And I think this is interesting, the Article 14 of the Treaty on Women. This article refers to rural women, that they have equal access to participation in the concerns of their communities and that they enjoy adequate living conditions, particularly in relation to housing, sanitation, electricity and water supply, transport and communications. And the Convention on the Rights of the Child, to combat disease and malnutrition, including within the framework of primary health care, through inter alia the application of readily available technology and through the provision of adequate nutritious foods and clean drinking water, taking into consideration the dangers and risks of environmental pollution. And this is the Convention for People with Disability, which is needed for them to fully participate in whatever else is happening in their country. So the right to food, the right to availability of food of sufficient quality, and sufficient quality includes food safety, especially from contamination and bad environmental hygiene, states' duties to prevent third parties from depriving others of access to adequate food. States are encouraged to ensure that activities of the private sector are in line with the right to food. The right to food includes, of course, the opportunity to produce food, and without good agricultural land, the very right to food is compromised. And it's in this area that the right to food is affected by activities such as coal seam gas. Because as we know, coal seam gas and other mining activities have huge exploration and production areas in good, fertile, food-producing areas here in Australia. Some of the farmers are prepared to use water from CSG for irrigating. However, there are many fears about the true nature of this water because it's not fully known. And other effects have been seen on what's happening to animals who eat contaminated food or drink contaminated water. But the issue of deprivation of access to food comes from the taking over of good cropping land by CSG and other mining operations. And a Senate Standing Committee report in November 2011 stated the exploration for or production of gas has the potential to severely disrupt virtually every aspect of agricultural production on cropping lands and in extreme circumstances remove the land from production. And in a future directions paper of December 2014, Jack D'Annunzio, a research analyst, Global Food and Water Crisis Research Program, says, the pollution of productive agricultural land not only risks Australian food security, creating food safety issues, but also our food export ambitions. Land and water pollution issues can tarnish Australia's reputation as a safe, clean, green food producer overseas. So surely the loss of agricultural land with worldwide implications can be a powerful tool when advocating against mining activities on such land. We have seen some success in regards to this with the prevention of mining in Felton and at Warra, both important and significant cropping areas close to here. And for the last few years, Felton celebrates its success with the Felton Food Festival, showcasing local produce, and it's become a significant event on the Darlingsdown tourist calendar. So may there be more such successes. The right to housing is about the right to legal security of tenure, the right to housing that provides protection against threats of health. Housing cannot be built in places where sources of pollution may impact the right to health, and protection from forced eviction, harassment and other threats. And there are four main ways in which fracking impacts negatively on housing and living conditions. Availability, quality, forced displacement, and the quality of community life. The availability issue arises when huge numbers of temporary workers arrive in a community and push up rents and reduce available properties. This has been very obvious in this town. And during the construction phase of CSG activity, very high rents force long-term residents out of their homes. Now that the construction period is over, the rents have come back down and the owners of these properties are now being affected. And I'm sure Karen can tell us the whole story about this in Chinchilla. But the quality of housing is affected as a result of devaluation from the impact of mining on water and soil, and also on the incursion of roads, pipelines and wells. Forced displacement can occur in a couple of ways. One is when the company decides that they will buy out a landholder. And this usually takes place when a deal is done in secret and the company is then able to have full control of what happens on that land. The second type of forced displacement can arise from health fears or from real mental health concerns. Fear of the unknown effects of long-term exposure to gases, water and soil in a gas field can force some folks to leave, especially if they have children. Others have been feeling mentally unwell because of similar fears and decide to leave for their own health. Community life itself can be disrupted by the presence of mining activities in that community, and we've already heard from Karen this morning about how that's affected the community here in Chinchilla. So the right to access information. And some of the key components of this right include: governments must observe the principles of maximum disclosure and good faith.
That's a funny one.
Why do you laugh? And in observing good faith, governments should ensure easy and effective access to information and avoid excessive restriction on access to information and provide reasons for refusal. It is also expected that the public authorities and third parties should give full and equal access to information about water and the environment to individuals and groups, and full disclosure of information on proposed measures that can affect the right to water as required. So, as already has been mentioned, access to information regarding the composition of fracking fluids has not been fully disclosed. This means that necessary information regarding health issues, the effects on water, soil and air are not fully understood. A second area of non-disclosure surrounds lawsuits against mining companies. It's also been difficult to obtain detailed information regarding many of the processes involved in fracking. Again, we can turn to Karen, and she is actually quoted in the guide that you will have access to. And this is what she was speaking about Chinchilla, and she reports, community consultation has been almost non-existent and inadequate. I was curious about a number of details about this process. How will the company ensure that all naturally occurring radioactive substances be removed? How will it address low molecular weight chemicals and able to be treated effectively by reverse osmosis? These and many more questions could not be answered. Response by email after some prodding came 4 weeks later and can only be described as manifestly inadequate. So that's here in Chinchilla. This lack of transparency makes it difficult for individuals to assess their own circumstances and risk of harm when faced with human rights violation from activities. According to human rights law, access to information is an obligation concerning the main health problems in the community, including methods of preventing and controlling them. Here again is another instance of the violation of human rights by companies who keep much of their processes from the public gaze. And this is the right to public participation. And again, sorry you can't see it, and even though this is really written for nanas. The right to participation in the conduct of public affairs. The right to public participation cannot be realised unless freedom of speech, assembly and association are also implemented. Decision-making processes must establish permanent spaces at national and local levels with representation of peoples and communities concerned, companies and local authorities. The right to public participation in political decisions that can affect the right to health. The guide notes that participation through public debate and dialogue is a right used to defend other rights that could be impacted by fracking. It also states that public participation is particularly important in the development of national strategies. It's a process that needs to be used before decisions are made about such things as the right to water, food, housing, etc. Once the decision has been made, we know how difficult it is to protest over a wrong decision. Often, of course, governments will say that they have enabled dialogue through consultation, But that consultation is often very limited and aimed at arriving at a desired outcome. However, it is important. It is important that we know that the right to public participation exists in international law and can give weight to our protests, our demonstrations against what we see as a defence of other rights. So those are the rights that have been enshrined in international law that can be used, but how can we use them? The United Nations Mining Working Group has developed a rights-based litmus test. This test identifies policies that are people-centred, contribute to the eradication of poverty, and promote a world that is just, equitable and inclusive, as well as sustainable. And I won't go through it, but I can tell you where you can find it. The rights-based litmus test. So the first principle of a rights-based litmus test is to do no harm. So the question is, to what extent can extractive activities be carried out without violating human rights, including the rights to health, etc.? To what extent can these activities be carried out without damaging vital ecosystems or threatening Earth's capacity? Are disadvantaged or marginalised groups particularly vulnerable? Can measures be taken to protect the population from situations that violate human rights, which tend to accompany extractive industries, including trafficking, land grabbing, insecurity and armed conflict? The second principle is eradicate root causes of poverty. Does the local community enjoy greater enjoyment of their human rights as a result of the development? Do the positive contributions of extractive activity prioritise the promotion of human rights among the most disadvantaged or marginalised groups? And does the extractive activity effectively contribute to eradicating poverty? The third principle is people as rights holders. Do potential affected people and communities have sufficient access to information and policy making spaces? Are there conditions that allow disaffected communities and human rights defenders to fully exercise their rights? Is effective remedy guaranteed if harm does occur? The fourth principle is sustainability. What are the effects of potential mining activity in the immediate and or short term? Based on all available evidence and indication, how will this extractive activity affect the rights of future generations mid to long term? Can uncertainty be overcome in strict adherence to the precautionary principle? So, the idea is, if a situation is to become operative, does it meet all those requirements of the litmus test? The UN Mining Working Company believes that not only when the litmus test is passed, only when the litmus test is passed, can extractive activity be included in a rights-based sustainable development. I think that we can safely say that most extractive activities that we see operating here in Australia would fail the litmus test.
Yep.
So I hope that this gives you some ways of continuing to confront what you see as unjustified mining of interventions. I'm just going to show you now two interventions at the United Nations made on behalf of this community by the Sisters of Mercy. The first was an oral intervention at the United Nations Human Rights Council, and the statement concerned the increasingly urgent and widespread issue of fracking impacts on human rights. So the Sisters of Mercy with the non-governmental organisation Mining Working Group and the Western Downs and Wide Unconventional Gas Group of Chinchilla, Australia, So this was an intervention made at the Human Rights Council by Sister Anya on behalf of this area. And then the second one was consideration and adoption of the Universal Periodic Review. This is something that everybody has to go through, each country who has ratified conventions to United Nations. And so this was the second intervention made in March last year on behalf of this community. So that just shows you that there are some ways that can use that document to make some interventions if you have someone working at the United Nations who can do that on your behalf. So from the Sisters of Mercy, we say to you, keep up the good work and on behalf of all the Earth community, human and non-human, all being affected by the various extractive industries, may in the future we see more of this and less of this.